My name is Jackson, and this is my story. The day started like any other, buzzing with excitement, filled with laughter, and carrying that carefree energy that only comes when you're surrounded by friends, far from home, and ready for an adventure. Our school trip had been planned for months, and everyone had been counting down the days. There was something magical about stepping onto that bus, knowing that for the next few days, life would be different. No homework, no early alarms, no responsibilities, just time to explore, to laugh, to make memories. The ride itself was a blur of noise and motion. Jokes were tossed across the aisle, music played from someone's speaker, and every so often, a teacher's voice would cut through the chaos, telling us to settle down. Not that anyone really listened, that was part of the fun. Outside, the city faded into rolling hills and open roads, but none of us paid much attention. The real adventure wasn't out there. It was inside the bus, in the way we talked over each other, in the way time stretched in the best way possible. Looking back, I wonder, if I had known what was coming, would I have paid more attention? Would I have memorized the way the sky looked that day, the way the trees swayed in the wind, the way everything felt so perfectly normal? Maybe. But the truth is, none of us saw it coming. 1 second, everything was fine. The next, it wasn't. There was no warning, no slow build-up to prepare us. Just a sudden violent jolt, a deafening sound that swallowed everything. And then, nothing. No pain, no fear, no sensation of movement. Just silence. At first, I thought I had blacked out. Any second now, I expected to wake up on the floor of the bus, with people crowded around me, shaking my shoulders, asking if I was okay. But as the moments stretched, if they were even moments, I realized something was terribly wrong. I wasn't on the floor. I wasn't even inside the bus anymore. I was above it, hovering, watching. I wasn't standing or floating, at least not in any way I understood. But somehow, I was looking down at the wreckage below. My mind struggled to process it. The bus had skidded off the road, the front crushed against something, the windows shattered, bodies scattered in ways that didn't make sense. And yet, none of it felt real, because somehow I was seeing it all without being in it. And then I saw myself. That was the moment everything shifted. There I was, my body, crumpled against one of the seats, motionless. Someone was leaning over me, shaking my shoulders, their face twisted in panic. But I felt none of it. The scene below was frantic, people screaming, crying, frozen in shock. Yet I was eerily calm. It was like watching a movie. Except it wasn't a movie. It was my life. And I wasn't supposed to be separate from it. I tried to speak. No sound. I tried to move. Nothing happened. I was there, but not there. Then I felt it. A pull. An invisible force, gentle yet undeniable, wrapping around me and tugging me away from the wreckage. It wasn't painful, but it was absolute. The accident, the flashing lights, the rising chaos. It all started to blur, fading faster than I could comprehend. But it wasn't just distance pulling me away. It was something deeper. Reality itself was slipping through my fingers. I wanted to fight it, to force my way back into my body, back into the life I had just been living moments ago. But the harder I tried to hold on, the faster I was pulled away. And then, I felt something else. A presence. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. And in that moment, I knew. Everything was about to change. Something surrounded me, filling every part of my being with a sensation I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even confusion anymore. It was something greater. Something that made every thought, every worry, every instinct to resist seem completely insignificant. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pulling stopped. I was no longer floating above the accident. I was somewhere else. And I knew, without a shred of doubt, that I wasn't on Earth anymore. I was moving, yet there was no direction. No up, no down, no left or right. Just a feeling of being drawn away from everything I had ever known. The accident, the school trip, the bus, my body. It all felt distant now, like a fading memory of something that had happened to someone else. I should have felt afraid, should have been desperate to understand what was happening. But instead, there was only stillness. At first, there was darkness. Not the kind that comes with night, not the kind that makes you strain your eyes to see. This was something deeper. A vast, endless emptiness. But it wasn't cold or frightening. It was peaceful. Time didn't exist here. I couldn't tell if I had been floating for seconds or hours. My mind should have been racing, but it wasn't. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking at all. I was simply being. And then, something changed. A light. It wasn't sudden or blinding, but it began to grow, spreading from somewhere beyond my vision, dissolving the darkness around me. It wasn't just bright. It was alive. It carried warmth, not the kind you feel on your skin, but the kind that reaches into your very soul. I hadn't even realized how empty I felt until I was wrapped in it, until it filled every part of me, until I understood that this light wasn't just something I was seeing. It was something I was becoming. The force that had pulled me from Earth was still there, but it no longer felt like I was being taken against my will. It was different now, gentler, like a guiding hand leading me forward. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see who or what was with me, but I felt it. A presence. It was vast, overwhelming, something so immense that I should have been terrified. But I wasn't, because whatever was guiding me knew me. It had always known me. I drifted, weightless, the light growing stronger with every passing moment. And inside me, a feeling began to bloom, something I had never experienced before. It was peace, but more than that, it was love. Not the kind of love you feel from family, not even the kind you find in the best moments of life. This was something far beyond that. A love so complete, so absolute, that there was no room for fear, no space for doubt. I wanted to stay there forever. But just as that thought crossed my mind, something shifted. The light didn't dim. It opened, revealing something more. My awareness expanded, as if I was beginning to understand things I had never even thought to ask. The warmth deepened, the presence around me became clearer, and then I saw him. At first, all I could register was the light. Except this wasn't just any light. This was something alive. It didn't just illuminate the space around me. It filled me, wrapping around every part of my being like the warmest embrace, dissolving any last remnants of fear or confusion. I wasn't floating anymore. I wasn't standing either. I simply was, existing in a way that felt more natural than anything I had ever known. And as my vision adjusted to the brilliance of it all, I saw him. There was no mistaking who he was. I knew, instantly. I didn't need anyone to tell me. I didn't need a single word of confirmation. Every fiber of my soul recognized him, the same way a child knows their mother's voice in a crowded room, the same way the sun brings warmth without needing permission. It was Jesus. He stood before me, not just as a man, but as something infinitely more. His presence radiated a power I couldn't begin to comprehend. And yet, there was no fear. Only love. A love so deep, so pure, that I felt like I could melt into it and never want for anything again. Every doubt I had ever carried, every question, every worry, vanished. Because in that moment, I knew. And now, I had found it. Or rather, he had found me. Jesus looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite put into words. It was kindness, but not just kindness. It was understanding, compassion, truth. It was as if he could see everything I had ever been, everything I had ever done. And yet, there was no judgment in his gaze, only knowing. "My child," he said. His voice wasn't just something I heard, it was something I felt. It moved through me, resonating in every part of my being, wrapping around me like a melody I had always known but had somehow forgotten. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, not because I was overwhelmed, but because words suddenly felt too small, too insignificant for this moment. Jesus smiled, as if he understood. And of course, he did. He understood everything. Then, without a word, he extended his hand toward me. I didn't even think. I just reached. And the moment my hand touched his, something exploded within me. Not in a way that was painful, not in a way that was frightening, but in a way that was transformative. In that single touch, I was being remade. Everything around me shifted, and suddenly, I was no longer just standing in light. I was somewhere else. The place before me was beyond anything my mind could fully comprehend. I had seen beautiful things before, sunsets that painted the sky with impossible colors, mountains that stretched beyond the clouds, oceans that seemed to go on forever. But this was something else entirely. It was life itself, woven into landscapes too stunning to exist on Earth. The sky wasn't just blue. It was alive, filled with hues I had no name for, moving like waves of light and warmth. The air wasn't just fresh. It carried a scent that made me feel whole, a fragrance so perfect it could only belong to heaven. I looked around, and for the first time, I understood. I was in heaven. But it wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a feeling, an existence with no limits, no boundaries, no end. There was no pain here, no sorrow, no fear, only peace, not the kind of peace that comes and goes, not the kind that is fleeting, but the kind that is eternal, unshakable, absolute. Jesus walked beside me, and with every step, I felt like I had always been here. Like this was home in a way Earth had never been. Time didn't feel real anymore. I could have been here for seconds or for eternity, and it wouldn't have made any difference. And yet, something strange. Though I was walking, I felt no weight, no exhaustion, no hunger, no thirst, no aching in my body. Because here, my body didn't matter the way it had on Earth. I was free. Everywhere I looked, I saw beauty, rivers of golden light flowing like water, fields of flowers singing melodies that couldn't exist anywhere else, colors so deep and vivid that they felt alive. But more than anything, I felt love. It was in the air, in the ground, in every sound, in every breath. Love filled everything. Then Jesus stopped walking. When I turned to look at him, I saw that his expression had changed. There was still love in his eyes, still peace. But now, there was something else. Urgency. I felt it before he even spoke. "Do you understand why you are here?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but beneath the gentleness, there was weight. I opened my mouth, finally able to speak, but I didn't know what to say. "Am I dead?" The question felt strange on my tongue, because I didn't feel dead. I felt more alive than I ever had before. Jesus smiled again, but this time, it was sad. "You are here because there is something you must see, something you must understand, and when the time comes, something you must share." A strange pull stirred in my chest, a sensation I couldn't name. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go back. But before I could say anything, before I could even begin to process his words, Everything around us began to change. The golden rivers, the endless skies, the music of heaven. It all faded, shifting, transforming into something else, something darker. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding, because whatever was about to happen, whatever he was about to show me, I knew one thing for certain. It would change everything. The warmth of heaven, the beauty, the overwhelming sense of love and peace. All of it was slipping away. I could feel it before I saw it, a change in the very air around me, as if something unseen had just turned the pages of a story. I wasn't ready to leave behind. The music that had once filled my soul began to dim, fading into something else, something heavier. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding, because I knew something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for, something I would never be able to forget. And then, without a word, he showed me the world. It wasn't like looking at a screen. It wasn't like watching from a distance. I was inside it, as if I had been dropped into the middle of Earth, without truly being part of it. I could see everything, hear everything, but I wasn't seen. I was simply there, existing between heaven and the brokenness of the world. And it was broken. The first thing I noticed was the division. People screaming at each other, faces twisted in anger, voices raised in hatred. I saw leaders standing in rooms thick with tension, politicians, world figures, powerful men and women, debating, arguing, blaming. Some of their faces I recognized, others I didn't. But the message was the same. They weren't seeking peace. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for control. Their words were empty, their promises hollow, their intentions clouded by pride. I watched as nations turned against nations, leaders sitting at long tables, their expressions tight, their hands gripping papers that meant nothing. They spoke of solutions, strategies, alliances, wars, economies, but none of them spoke of God. And then I saw the people. They weren't just divided by borders, by governments, by policies. They were divided in their hearts. Friends had turned into enemies. Families had been torn apart, not by war, by something worse, hatred. I saw brothers who no longer spoke, parents who had abandoned their children over differences that didn't matter, entire communities that had once stood together, now shattered by suspicion and resentment. And worst of all, I saw faith slipping away. Churches that had once been filled with worship stood empty. Some had been converted into places of business. Others left abandoned, their walls cracked, their doors locked. And the ones that remained, many of them were unrecognizable. I saw pastors standing on stages, speaking words that made people comfortable, but never convicted. I saw people nodding along, content to hear what they wanted, not what they needed. And then, Jesus, standing beside me, watching it all, finally spoke. They are looking in the wrong places for answers. His voice was steady, filled with sorrow, filled with something even deeper, urgency. They look to men for wisdom, to governments for security, to wealth for comfort, to themselves for truth. But none of these things can save them. Only I can bring peace. The weight of his words settled over me like a storm cloud, pressing into my very soul. I saw it. I understood it. The world wasn't falling apart because of politics, because of money, because of conflicts between nations. It was falling apart because people had turned away from God. I wanted to look away, wanted to close my eyes and pretend I hadn't seen it, pretend I hadn't heard the desperation in Jesus' voice. But I couldn't, because he wasn't done. The vision shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just seeing the division, the coldness of the world. I was seeing its consequences. People who had everything the world had to offer, yet felt emptier than ever. I saw a man in a suit sitting in a massive office, his bank accounts overflowing, his influence unmatched. Yet his eyes were filled with nothing but exhaustion and regret. I saw a young woman scrolling through her phone, surrounded by people, yet more alone than she had ever been. She was searching for something, for meaning, for connection, for love. But all she found was comparison, jealousy, emptiness. I saw families who had lost each other, not because of distance, but because of silence. Parents who had chosen work over their children, children who had chosen resentment over forgiveness, homes filled with everything except love. A sorrow unlike anything I had ever known rose in my chest, because I understood. Jesus wasn't just showing me a broken world. He was showing me a world that was lost, a world that had chosen to be lost. They do not see, Jesus said softly, his eyes still locked on the world below. They do not listen. They do not seek me, because they believe they no longer need me. His words felt final, like a judge handing down a verdict. But then I saw something worse. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The world was already in chaos, already unraveling. But then I saw it, a darkness, spreading across the earth, slow, but unstoppable. It wasn't like the natural darkness of night, not like shadows cast by the sun. It was something else, something alive, and it was consuming everything. I turned to Jesus, panic rising in my soul. "What is that?" And his next words made my heart stop. "This is what happens when they refuse to turn back." Then Jesus showed me something even more terrifying. The darkness moved, slow but unstoppable, like a living thing, devouring everything in its path. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes, to block it out somehow. But I couldn't, because I was standing beside Jesus, and he was showing me this for a reason. It wasn't just a vision. It was a warning. The world I had known was vanishing before my eyes, replaced by something unrecognizable. Cities that once pulsed with life were now overrun with desperation. The streets, once alive with movement and energy, now trembled under the weight of fear. People were running, not towards something, but away. Away from chaos, away from violence, away from something unseen but deeply felt. Even the air itself carried a weight, thick with an almost suffocating tension. I could feel it pressing against my chest. In the distance, voices screamed, but they all blurred together into a haunting sound that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just panic, it was hopelessness. Nations were crumbling, not from war, not from disaster, but from something far more insidious, from within. I saw governments collapsing under their own weight. Institutions that once seemed unshakable, falling apart, as if they had never been built on anything solid to begin with. Then, my eyes were drawn to something specific, a gathering of world leaders. Their faces twisted in frustration and anger, some familiar, some unknown, their voices raised, their hands gesturing wildly, desperate to maintain control over something that was already lost. Surrounded by powerful figures, caught in the same endless struggle, arguing, debating, pointing fingers, searching for solutions that would never come. Papers slammed onto tables, discussions turned heated. But there was no unity, no agreement. It was as if none of them truly understood what was happening, as if they were fighting the wrong battle. I turned to Jesus, desperation rising in my voice. Is this because of them? His gaze never left the vision before us, but his voice was steady, firm. This is not about them. I frowned, confusion twisting in my mind. But they're the ones in charge. They're the ones making the decisions. At that moment, Jesus turned to me, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Sorrow. The true battle is not political, he said. It is spiritual. I felt my breath catch. The enemy does not care who is in power, only that the world remains divided. He wants destruction. He wants fear. He wants people to turn on each other, to lose sight of what truly matters. I looked back at the leaders, their faces lined with exhaustion, their voices hoarse from shouting. Some looked angry, some looked desperate, some looked completely lost. And then I saw something else, something lurking behind them, in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It wasn't something physical. It was a presence, a force that moved unseen, yet undeniable. It whispered into the ears of those who were supposed to be leading, and they leaned in without even realizing it. It twisted their thoughts, fed their pride, fueled their anger, blinded them to truth. Jesus spoke again. This is the true war, not against flesh and blood, but against the darkness that seeks to consume this world, and they do not see it. His words settled deep into my soul like a weight I could never shake. I saw it now. The chaos, the division, the endless fighting. It wasn't random. It wasn't just human nature. It was a battle between light and darkness, and most people didn't even know they were part of it. The vision shifted. Now I saw not the halls of power, but the streets of everyday life. People consumed with distractions, chasing money, chasing status, chasing validation from strangers who didn't even care. They were more connected than ever, yet more divided than they had ever been. They had opinions about everything, but wisdom about nothing. They craved attention, but rejected truth. I saw families sitting in the same room, yet never speaking to each other. I saw people glued to their screens, blind to the world collapsing around them. I saw children growing up with no knowledge of God, no sense of faith, no understanding of the purpose of their souls. And then I saw something that sent a chill through me. Churches. Some stood empty, their doors closed, their pews covered in dust, abandoned long ago. Others were filled with people, but their hearts were elsewhere. I saw preachers who had traded truth for popularity, afraid to offend, afraid to lose followers, afraid to speak the words that needed to be spoken. I saw worship that had become performance, faith that had become routine, prayer that had become an afterthought. And yet, no one noticed. The world was falling apart. But instead of turning to God, people were turning to everything else. The news, the politicians, the influencers, the celebrities, the trends, the distractions. Everything except the one thing that could actually save them. Jesus' voice was heavy with sadness. They are too distracted to see the truth, he said, too divided to recognize what is happening. And if they do not turn back soon, the time will come when it will be too late. A tightness gripped my chest. My soul ached with the weight of what I was seeing. There had to be hope. There had to be a way to change this. I turned to Jesus, my voice barely above a whisper. Is there still time? For the first time since the vision shifted. Jesus' expression softened. The sorrow was still there, but behind it, something else emerged. Hope. There is still time, he said, but not forever, and those who wish to change must start now. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There was still time. There was still a chance to change everything. But then, Jesus' face grew serious again. Come, he said. There is more you must see. The weight of everything I had witnessed sat heavy in my soul. Nations divided, people lost in distraction and fear, a world slipping further into chaos. But as the darkness pulled away, I realized something had changed. The sorrow, the confusion, the overwhelming despair. It was still there, but now something else was rising in its place. Hope. I turned to Jesus, my heart racing with questions I wasn't sure I had the strength to ask. How could things change? How could the world be saved when it was so lost? Was there any way to undo what I had just seen? Before I could even speak, Jesus answered. They are looking in the wrong places for answers. His voice was steady, unshaken, filled with something deeper than sadness, authority. They search for peace in politics, for security in wealth, for purpose in power. But none of these things will ever satisfy. None of these things will save them. His words struck me like a wave, sinking deep into my soul. I had seen it. People desperately clinging to things that would never last, chasing distractions while their souls remained empty. They thought success would bring them peace. They thought the right leader, the right law, the right movement would fix everything. But it never did, and it never would. I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady. Then, what is the answer? Jesus turned away from the fading vision of the broken world and looked at me, straight into me. The answer, he said, is me. The words were so simple. And yet, in that moment, I understood. It had always been him. It had always been about him. Everything people were searching for, peace, love, truth, purpose, it was never going to be found in this world. It was never going to be found in money, or fame, or government, or relationships, or anything else people clung to so desperately. The world didn't need another political debate, another leader, another war, another movement. It needed Jesus. They must return to prayer, Jesus continued, his voice unwavering. They must seek me daily, not just in times of trouble. They must put love before anger, faith before fear. They must learn to recognize my voice again. I saw it then. People had not stopped believing in God. They had simply stopped listening. They prayed when they wanted something, but they never waited for an answer. They read scripture, but only the parts that made them comfortable. They spoke about faith, but they did not live it. They have lost their connection with me, Jesus said, his voice soft but firm. They speak my name, but their hearts are far from me. If they do not return, the world will remain as it is, lost, broken, blind. The weight of his words pressed into me, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. There was still time, but time was running out. I looked at him, desperation rising in my chest. But will they listen? Jesus held my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something behind his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Pain. Some will, he said, but not all. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted him to tell me that everything would change, that everyone would wake up, that once they heard the truth, they would return to God. But Jesus wasn't going to tell me what I wanted to hear, only what I needed to know. I thought of the people I had seen in the vision, the ones too distracted to notice the darkness creeping in, the ones too consumed by their own lives to hear the warnings, the ones who wouldn't listen, no matter how many signs were given to them. It made my heart ache. But I knew Jesus would not force them to come back. He had given them free will. He had given them the choice. And yet, despite knowing that not everyone would listen, despite knowing that some would refuse to see the truth, Jesus still offered hope. He still offered mercy. "That is why I am sending you back," he said. The word sent a shock through me, like a door opening, one I had never expected to walk through. I hadn't even thought about what would come next. I had been too caught up in everything he had shown me, too overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But now I understood. I was not here to stay. I was not meant to remain in this place. I had to return. A part of me wanted to argue. A part of me wanted to beg to stay. How could I go back after everything I had seen? How could I return to a world so broken when I had tasted the perfection of heaven? But even as those thoughts raced through my mind, I knew Jesus was right. I had to go back. I had to tell them. There was still time. There was still a way to change everything. But the choice was not mine. The choice belonged to them. I didn't want to leave heaven, but I knew Jesus was right. I stood there in silence, trying to process what he had just told me. But my heart could not accept it. I knew the truth. I understood the weight of it. And yet, deep within me, something resisted. How could I return to the world after experiencing this place? How could I leave behind the overwhelming love, the endless peace, the absolute perfection of heaven, and willingly go back to a world that was broken, divided, and full of suffering? The thought of waking up in my body again, of feeling the limitations of human weakness, of carrying this knowledge while watching so many refuse to see the truth. It felt unbearable. I turned to Jesus, desperation rising in my chest like a tide that could not be held back. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely strong enough to form the words. "Don't send me back. Let me stay here. With you." Jesus looked at me, his expression filled with both love and... He stood in silence, not out of distance or hesitation, but as if he was giving me the space to fully feel the weight of my emotions, to acknowledge them, to release them. His silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who understood, someone who had already seen the thoughts racing through my mind before I could even speak them. Then, finally, he smiled. Not a smile meant to soothe or soften a painful truth, but one filled with something deeper, both sorrow and purpose. I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady. "Then, what is the answer?" Jesus turned away from the fading vision of the broken world and looked at me, straight into me. "The answer," he said, "is me." The words were so simple. And yet, in that moment, I understood. It had always been him. It had always been about him. Everything people were searching for, peace, love, truth, purpose, it was never going to be found in this world. It was never going to be found in money, or fame, or government, or relationships, or anything else people clung to so desperately. The world didn't need another political debate, another leader, another war, another movement. It needed Jesus. "They must return to prayer," Jesus continued, his voice unwavering. "They must seek me daily, not just in times of trouble. They must put love before anger, faith before fear. They must learn to recognize my voice again." I saw it then. People had not stopped believing in God. They had simply stopped listening. They prayed when they wanted something, but they never waited for an answer. They read scripture, but only the parts that made them comfortable. They spoke about faith, but they did not live it. "They have lost their connection with me," Jesus said, his voice soft but firm. "They speak my name, but their hearts are far from me. If they do not return, the world will remain as it is, lost, broken, blind." The weight of his words pressed into me, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. There was still time, but time was running out. I looked at him, desperation rising in my chest. But will they listen? Jesus held my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something behind his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Pain. "Some will," he said, "but not all." The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted him to tell me that everything would change, that everyone would wake up, that once they heard the truth, they would return to God. But Jesus wasn't going to tell me what I wanted to hear, only what I needed to know. I thought of the people I had seen in the vision, the ones too distracted to notice the darkness creeping in, the ones too consumed by their own lives to hear the warnings, the ones who wouldn't listen, no matter how many signs were given to them. It made my heart ache. But I knew Jesus would not force them to come back. He had given them free will. He had given them the choice. And yet, despite knowing that not everyone would listen, despite knowing that some would refuse to see the truth, Jesus still offered hope. He still offered mercy. "That is why I am sending you back," he said. The words sent a shock through me, like a door opening, one I had never expected to walk through. I hadn't even thought about what would come next. I had been too caught up in everything he had shown me, too overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But now I understood. I was not here to stay. I was not meant to remain in this place. I had to return. A part of me wanted to argue. A part of me wanted to beg to stay. How could I go back after everything I had seen? How could I return to a world so broken when I had tasted the perfection of heaven? But even as those thoughts raced through my mind, I knew Jesus was right. I had to go back. I had to tell them. There was still time. There was still a way to change everything. But the choice was not mine. The choice belonged to them. I didn't want to leave heaven, but I knew Jesus was right. I stood there in silence, trying to process what he had just told me. But my heart could not accept it. I knew the truth. I understood the weight of it. And yet, deep within me, something resisted. How could I return to the world after experiencing this place? How could I leave behind the overwhelming love, the endless peace, the absolute perfection of heaven, and willingly go back to a world that was broken, divided, and full of suffering? The thought of waking up in my body again, of feeling the limitations of human weakness, of carrying this knowledge, while watching so many refuse to see the truth. It felt unbearable. I turned to Jesus, desperation rising in my chest like a tide that could not be held back. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely strong enough to form the words. "Don't send me back. Let me stay here. With you." Jesus looked at me, his expression filled with both love and... He stood in silence, not out of distance or hesitation, but as if he was giving me the space to fully feel the weight of my emotions, to acknowledge them, to release them. His silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who understood, someone who had already seen the thoughts racing through my mind before I could even speak them. Then, finally, he smiled. Not a smile meant to soothe or soften a painful truth, but one filled with something deeper, both sorrow and purpose. "You have a purpose," he said, his voice gentle, yet carrying an undeniable authority. "You have a message to share." I shook my head, not in defiance, but in helplessness, the way someone does when faced with something far greater than they feel capable of handling. "But how?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "How can I go back after seeing all of this? How can I return to that world knowing what's waiting for it, knowing that so many won't listen?" Jesus reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, and the moment he did, something indescribable filled me, an energy, a warmth, a presence that was more than physical or spiritual. It settled deep within my soul, making it clear that everything I had just witnessed, everything I had just learned, would remain a part of me forever. "You will not be alone," he said. And in those words, there was a promise. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to trust that when I returned, I wouldn't be overwhelmed, that I wouldn't feel lost, that I wouldn't struggle under the weight of this knowledge. But deep inside, fear still lingered. Not fear of death or suffering. I had seen those things for what they truly were. I was afraid of being unheard. I was afraid of carrying this message only to have it dismissed, ignored, or ridiculed. Jesus must have known my thoughts because his grip on my shoulder tightened slightly, anchoring me in place, as if to remind me that no matter how great the struggle, no matter how heavy the burden, he would be with me through it all. This message is not yours to carry alone, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made everything else fade away. I will be with you. I will guide you. And those who have ears to hear will listen. I wanted to ask more, to plead, to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he would let me stay. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I already knew what had to happen next. I felt it before I saw it. The shift, the pull. It started subtly. A faint awareness that something was changing. Something was drawing me away. Then, all at once, it became undeniable. I gasped as my body, if I could even call it that in this place, tensed, the sensation of being pulled back overwhelming me. Heaven was fading. Jesus was still looking at me, still holding on to me in a way that wasn't physical, but I was leaving. I wasn't ready. I hadn't said everything I wanted to say. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side. Then, in the midst of my fear, in the chaos of being pulled back toward a world I no longer felt like I belonged to, I heard Jesus' voice one last time, steady, unshaken. Go, tell them. The time is short. And then, darkness. The first thing I felt was weight. A crushing, suffocating heaviness pressing down on me, anchoring me to something solid. Every breath felt like I was being dragged back into a dense, unfamiliar reality. My lungs burned, my body ached, my skin tingled like I had been plunged into ice-cold water. There was noise, voices, beeping machines, hurried footsteps, but it all seemed distant, muffled, as if I were underwater, caught between two worlds. My mind clung to the last remnants of where I had been, struggling to understand what was happening. Then, suddenly, I gasped. Air rushed into my lungs with such force, it felt like my chest might collapse under the weight of it. My eyes flew open, and the world snapped into focus. Bright hospital lights overhead, sterile white walls, blurred figures moving frantically around me. He's awake. A nurse stood beside me, her face shifting from shock to relief as she reached for something, calling out to the doctors. I tried to move, but my body felt foreign, heavy, as if I had been asleep for years and had forgotten how to function. Every muscle ached, every limb resisted, but none of that mattered. Because the moment I opened my eyes, I knew I was back. I wasn't in heaven anymore. And the realization hit me harder than the accident itself. The warmth, the love, the peace. It was gone. The weight of my human body, the limitations of this world, the emptiness compared to what I had just experienced. It was unbearable. I had never known how heavy life was until I had experienced something beyond it. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding with an urgency I couldn't fully grasp. My ears were ringing, but through the noise I heard something. Crying. Slowly, stiffly, like my body no longer belonged to me, I turned my head. There, standing by my bed, were my parents. My mother had her hands over her mouth, trembling as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. My father, who never cried, had red, swollen eyes. I wanted to speak, to tell them I was okay. But I wasn't. I wasn't the same. A doctor leaned over me, checking my pulse, shining a light into my eyes, speaking words that barely registered. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? I blinked. The hospital, I croaked, my throat raw, my voice hoarse. He nodded, relief washing over his face. You were in an accident. You were unconscious for… He hesitated, as if unsure how to say it. Longer than we expected. The accident, the school trip, the crash. It felt like a lifetime ago. But what I had seen, the place I had been, was sharper than anything around me. My mind wasn't clouded. My thoughts weren't scattered like someone waking from a dream. I remembered everything, every word Jesus spoke, every vision he showed me, every overwhelming wave of love and urgency. It had been real, more real than this hospital, more real than the beeping machines, the sterile white walls, the worried faces around me, more real than Earth itself. Tears welled in my eyes, though I wasn't even sure why. Maybe because I had left something behind. Maybe because I knew, without a doubt, that I could never go back to the way things were. My mother stepped closer, hesitant, as if afraid that if she touched me, I might disappear again. You're awake, she whispered, her voice shaking. We thought we lost you. I turned to her, and everything I had been holding in threatened to spill over. I had been gone. I had seen what was beyond this life. And yet, here I was, alive. And I knew. I had come back for a reason. This wasn't a second chance just to return to my old life. I wasn't sent back to simply exist. I had a message to share. I had seen what was waiting on the other side. I had heard Jesus himself tell me that time was running out. I had felt the urgency of what was coming if people didn't turn back. I had been shown the truth, and now I had no choice but to tell others. The moment I left the hospital, I knew my life would never be the same again. Everything looked the same. The sky, the trees, the streets filled with people going about their day. But I was different. I no longer saw the world the way I once had. It wasn't just a place to live, to work, to chase things that didn't last. It was a place where every person walking past me had a soul, had a purpose, had a choice to make. And I had seen what happens when people forget that. I had seen the division, the fear, the endless search for peace in things that could never provide it. And I had seen what was waiting beyond this life. Something so beautiful, so powerful, so overwhelming that no words could ever truly capture it. Heaven is real. Jesus is real. And the urgency of his message is real. I started telling people what had happened to me. Some listened, eyes wide, hanging on every word. Some nodded politely, treating it like an interesting story, but nothing more. And then there were those who laughed, who dismissed it, who said it was just a dream, a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But I didn't let that stop me. I couldn't. Because this isn't about me. It's not about proving anything. It's about giving people the truth and letting them decide for themselves. It's about showing them that there is still hope, that they are still loved, that no matter how lost they feel, Jesus is waiting with open arms. Yes, the world is broken. But that doesn't mean you have to be. Yes, the world is filled with fear. But that doesn't mean you have to live in it. Yes, the world is searching for answers, but the truth has always been here. And it's simpler than people think. Pray. Seek Jesus. Choose love over hate. Faith over fear. Truth over convenience. Stop waiting for men to save you. Stop waiting for the world to fix itself. Jesus is the only way. I know some people will hear this and ignore it. I saw it in my vision. Jesus told me it would happen. But I also know that some will listen. Some will feel that pull in their hearts, the whisper of truth they've been drowning out for too long. So now, in this very moment, you have a choice. Will you listen to this message? Or will you ignore it like so many others have? Because I promise you this: Jesus is real, heaven is real, and the love he has for you is beyond anything you can imagine. No matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, he hasn't given up on you. And if you're still breathing, that means you still have time. But time is running out. And if you want to know more about what Jesus showed me, things I haven't shared yet, things you need to hear, watch my next video. There's more to this story, and you don't want to miss it. Like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear this message before it's too late. If this spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone out there needs to hear this. Jesus is calling. Will you answer?